I arrived at Ashford Manor on a morning so cold the frost clung to the iron gates like lace. The carriage that brought me from the village rattled over stones older than memory, and I pressed my gloved hands together, trying to steady the trembling that had nothing to do with the weather. I had been summoned, the letter said, to serve as nursemaid to the Duke's newborn daughter, a position that promised security I had never known, and a wage that would lift my mother from the edge of ruin. What I did not know then, what I could not have imagined, was that the child I would come to care for carried a secret so dangerous it could shatter the very walls of that ancient house. The housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, met me at the servants' entrance with a gaze that felt like an appraisal and a warning all at once. She was a tall woman, sharp-featured, her gray hair pinned so tightly it seemed to pull at her temples. She did not smile. She told me the household ran on silence and order, that the Duke valued discretion above all things, and that I was never, under any circumstance, to speak of what I saw or heard within these walls. I nodded, though my throat felt dry. She led me through dim corridors that smelled of beeswax and old wood, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow my steps. The manor was vast and cold, beautiful in the way a tomb might be beautiful, and I felt small inside it, like a moth drawn too close to a flame. Mrs. Calloway brought me to the nursery on the 3rd floor, a room draped in pale blue curtains and warmed by a fire that crackled softly in the hearth. The cradle stood near the window, carved from dark mahogany and lined with white linen so fine it looked like cloud. And there, nestled inside, was the baby. She was impossibly small, her skin soft as rose petals. Her tiny fists curled against her chest. Dark hair crowned her head in soft waves, and when she stirred, I saw her eyes, just beginning to open, were the same piercing gray as storm clouds. I felt my breath catch. Mrs. Calloway told me the child's name was Eleanor, that she had been adopted by the Duke after her mother died in childbirth, and that I was to care for her as though she were my own. But even as she spoke, I could not tear my gaze from the baby's face. There was something familiar in the shape of her brow, the angle of her tiny nose, something that whispered of lineage and blood. I asked Mrs. Calloway if I might meet the Duke and Duchess to understand their wishes for the child's care. She paused, her expression unreadable, and told me the Duke was often away on business, and the Duchess kept to her chambers. She said I would meet them in time, that patience was a virtue required of all who served in this house. Then she left me alone with Eleanor, and the silence settled over us like a veil. I lifted the baby from her cradle, cradling her against my chest, and she made a soft sound, neither cry nor coo, just a breath of life that seemed to anchor me to that moment. I whispered to her that I would keep her safe, that whatever secrets this house held, she would be loved. I did not know then how much that promise would cost me. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt both comforting and strange. I woke before dawn, tended to Eleanor's needs, fed her from bottles prepared by the kitchen, changed her linens, sang her lullabies my mother had sung to me. The nursery became my world, a place where time moved differently, measured not by the clock, but by the baby's hunger, her sleep, her tiny smiles that felt like miracles. I rarely saw the other servants. A maid brought my meals on a tray, always with her eyes downcast, never lingering to chat. Mrs. Calloway checked on me once a day. Her visits brief and formal, her questions always the same. Was the child well? Did I require anything? Was I keeping to the rules? I always answered yes, though the truth was I felt more like a prisoner than a servant, bound to that room and the child within it. It was on the 5th day that I first saw the Duchess. I had taken Eleanor downstairs for fresh air, wrapped in a shawl against the chill, and I stood in the entrance hall, admiring the way the light fell through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in jeweled colors. I heard footsteps, soft and slow, and turned to see a woman descending the grand staircase. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost fragile, her skin pale as porcelain. her dark hair pinned in an elaborate style that framed her face. She wore a gown of deep green silk that rustled as she moved, and her eyes, when they met mine, were the color of amber, but there was no warmth in them. She stopped halfway down the stairs, her hand gripping the banister, and she stared at Eleanor with an expression I could not name. It was not love, not exactly, but something deeper and more painful, like looking at a wound that refused to heal. I curtsied, my heart pounding, and introduced myself, explaining that I was the new nursemaid. The Duchess did not speak. She continued to stare at the baby, and I saw her jaw tighten, her fingers pressing white against the wood. Then, without a word, she turned and ascended the stairs, disappearing into the shadows of the upper hall. I stood there, holding Eleanor, feeling the weight of that silence press against my chest. The baby began to fuss, and I hurried back to the nursery, my thoughts a tangle of confusion and unease. Why had the Duchess looked at Eleanor with such pain? Why had she not spoken to me, not even a greeting or a command? I rocked the baby, whispering soothing sounds, but my mind kept circling back to that moment, to the way the Duchess's eyes had filled with something that looked like grief. That evening, as I sat by the fire with Eleanor asleep in my arms, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. They were heavier than the maid's, more deliberate, and they stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, waiting. And then the door opened, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat that smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. His hair was black, touched with silver at the temples, and his eyes, those piercing gray eyes, were the same as Eleanor's. I knew at once who he was, the Duke of Ashford. He looked at me with an expression that was both commanding and distant, as though I were a piece of furniture he had purchased and needed to inspect. He asked if the child was well, and I stammered that she was, that she slept soundly and fed without trouble. He nodded, his gaze shifting to Eleanor, and for a moment something softened in his face, a flicker of emotion quickly suppressed. He told me I was doing well, that he expected me to continue with the same diligence, and that I was to inform Mrs. Calloway immediately if anything seemed amiss with the child. Then he turned to leave, but paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. He said, without looking back, that Eleanor was precious to him, that she was all he had left of someone he had lost, and that I must protect her above all else. His voice cracked, just slightly, on those last words. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click. I sat there trembling, Eleanor warm and fragile in my arms, and I felt the first stirrings of understanding. This child was not simply adopted. She was his, born of his blood, and the secret of her existence was tearing this house apart. The weeks passed, and I became more attuned to the rhythms of Ashford Manor, to its silences and its shadows. I learned to recognize the sound of the Duke's footsteps, always late at night, when he would come to the nursery and stand by Eleanor's cradle, watching her sleep with an expression that broke my heart. I learned to avoid the Duchess, who wandered the halls like a ghost, her face always turned away, her hands clutching a handkerchief as though it were the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. I heard whispers among the servants, fragments of conversations quickly hushed when I drew near. They spoke of scandal, of a woman who had died, of a child who should not exist. I wanted to ask, to understand, but fear kept my tongue silent. I was here to care for Eleanor, nothing more, and I told myself that the rest was none of my concern. But concern, I learned, is not something you can choose. It grows inside you, quiet and insistent, until it becomes part of your very breath. I found myself watching the Duke and Duchess with a new awareness, noting the way they never spoke to one another, the way they occupied the same house yet lived in entirely separate worlds. I saw the way the Duke's eyes followed Eleanor with a hunger that was almost desperate, and the way the Duchess flinched whenever she heard the baby cry. I began to piece together the story, though no one had told it to me. Eleanor was the Duke's daughter, born of another woman, and the Duchess, childless and heartbroken, was forced to endure the living proof of her husband's betrayal. The baby I held in my arms was not just a child. She was the wound that would not close, the secret that poisoned every breath in this house. One night, as I rocked Eleanor to sleep, I heard voices rising from the floor below. They were muffled, but the anger in them was unmistakable. I crept to the door, holding the baby close, and listened. It was the Duke and Duchess, their words sharp and cutting. She accused him of bringing shame upon their name, of forcing her to live with the proof of his infidelity. He countered that Eleanor was innocent, that she deserved a chance at life, that he would not abandon his own child. The Duchess's voice broke, and she said something I could not quite hear, something that sounded like a plea or a curse. Then there was silence, and the sound of a door slamming, and footsteps retreating into the darkness. I closed the nursery door, my hands shaking, and looked down at Eleanor's sleeping face. She was so small, so unaware of the storm raging around her, and I felt a fierce protectiveness rise in my chest. Whatever happened, I would keep her safe. I would be the one constant in her chaotic world. But as I lay in my narrow bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I could not shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous. The Duke had claimed this child, had brought her into his home and given her his name. But at what cost? And why did the Duchess stay, trapped in a marriage that brought her only pain? I thought of my own mother, widowed and struggling, and I wondered if love, true love, could survive such betrayal, or if, in the end, we were all just prisoners of the choices we made and the secrets we kept. Eleanor stirred in her cradle, making a soft sound, and I rose to comfort her, whispering promises I hoped I could keep. The manor settled around us, its ancient bones creaking in the wind, and I felt the weight of its history pressing down, a reminder that some stories, once begun, could never be undone. Morning came with a pale light that barely pierced the heavy curtains, and I woke to find Mrs. Calloway standing in the doorway, her expression grave. She told me the Duchess had requested my presence in the drawing room, that I was to bring Eleanor with me. My heart leapt into my throat. This was the first time the Duchess had acknowledged me since that brief encounter on the stairs, and I did not know what to expect. I dressed quickly, smoothing my plain gray dress and pinning my hair back with trembling fingers. I wrapped Eleanor in her softest blanket and made my way downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The drawing room was a grand space, filled with velvet furniture and paintings of pastoral scenes, and the Duchess sat by the window, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She did not turn as I entered, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the fabric of her gown. I stood there, holding Eleanor, waiting for her to speak. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, and I wondered if I should say something, offer some word of greeting or apology, though I did not know what I might apologize for. Finally, the Duchess turned, and her eyes met mine, and I saw in them a depth of sorrow I had not expected. She looked at Eleanor, and her expression softened, just for a moment, before hardening again into something cold and distant. She told me, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, that she had wanted a child of her own for so long, that she had prayed and wept and begged for the blessing of motherhood, only to have it denied. And now, she said, she was forced to watch her husband dote on another woman's child, to see in Eleanor's face the proof of her own failure. Her voice broke, and she turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth, and I stood there, helpless, not knowing how to comfort her. I wanted to tell her that Eleanor was innocent, that she was just a baby who needed love. But the words felt hollow, even as they formed in my mind. The Duchess was not angry at the child. She was angry at the Duke, at fate, at the cruel twist of circumstances that had brought this child into her home. And perhaps, in some small way, she was angry at me, for being the one who got to hold Eleanor, to care for her, to be close to her in a way the Duchess could not allow herself to be. I curtsied, mumbled something about returning to the nursery, and fled, my heart aching for the broken woman I left behind. As I climbed the stairs, Eleanor gurgling softly in my arms, I realized that this house was not just haunted by secrets. It was haunted by longing, by the ghosts of what might have been, and I was caught in the middle, a witness to a tragedy I could not stop. That night, I dreamed of my own mother, of the small cottage where I had grown up, filled with laughter and light. I dreamed of a life where love was simple, where children were born of joy and not of scandal, where secrets did not lurk in every corner. But when I woke, it was to the sound of Eleanor crying, and the cold reality of Ashford Manor closed around me once more. I lifted her from her cradle, held her close, and whispered that I would be her anchor, her safe harbor in the storm. And as I rocked her back to sleep, I made a vow, silent and fierce. I would uncover the truth of her birth, of the woman who had died and the love that had been lost. I would understand why the Duke had claimed her and why the Duchess could not. Because Eleanor deserved to know her story, and I, bound to her by duty and something deeper, would be the one to tell it. The manor seemed to breathe around us, its walls holding centuries of secrets, and I felt for the first time that I was not just a servant. I was part of something larger, a story that had been unfolding long before I arrived and would continue long after I was gone. But for now, in this moment, with Eleanor's warmth against my chest and the fire casting shadows on the walls, I was exactly where I needed to be. And whatever came next, I would face it with the courage born of love and the determination to protect the innocent child in my care. The determination I felt that night carried me through the following days, though the path forward remained unclear. I had resolved to understand Eleanor's story, but I did not know where to begin. The servants avoided my questions with practiced skill, and Mrs. Calloway made it clear that curiosity was not a trait valued in this household. Still, I listened. I watched. I learned that information in a place like Ashford Manor was currency, and that patience could be as powerful as boldness. I kept my eyes open during my rare trips downstairs, noted which doors were always locked, which rooms the Duchess avoided, which corners of the estate the Duke visited when he thought no one was watching. It was during one of these quiet observations that I met Thomas, the head groundskeeper. He was an older man, perhaps 60, with weathered hands and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. I encountered him in the garden one afternoon when I had brought Eleanor outside for fresh air, hoping the spring sunshine might brighten the heaviness that clung to us both. He was pruning the rose bushes, his movements careful and practiced, and when he saw me, he tipped his cap and greeted me with a warmth I had not felt since arriving at the manor. We spoke of simple things at first, the weather, the gardens, the way the estate looked in different seasons. But then he asked about Eleanor, and something in his voice, a gentleness mixed with sorrow, made me trust him. I asked if he had been at Ashford Manor long, and he told me he had served the family for 40 years, had watched the current Duke grow from a boy into a man. He spoke of the Duke's father, a stern man who had ruled the estate with an iron hand, and of the Duke's mother, who had died when the Duke was young, leaving him to navigate a world of duty and expectation alone. Thomas said the Duke had always carried a sadness, even as a child, as though he knew he would never be allowed to live for himself. And then, several years ago, something had changed. The Duke had become more withdrawn, more haunted, and the household had grown quieter, more tense. Thomas did not say more, but his eyes drifted to Eleanor, and I understood. The change had come when Eleanor's mother entered the Duke's life. I wanted to ask who she was, this woman who had died and left behind a child that looked so much like the Duke. But before I could form the question, Mrs. Calloway appeared at the garden gate, her expression sharp with disapproval. She called me back inside, reminding me that my place was in the nursery, not wandering the grounds. I hurried away, Eleanor in my arms, but I glanced back at Thomas, and he gave me a small nod, as though to say he understood, and that when the time was right, he would tell me more. That brief exchange gave me hope. I was not entirely alone in this house. There were others who remembered, who knew the truth, and perhaps, if I was careful, I could piece together the story that everyone else seemed determined to bury. The nights grew longer as spring deepened into early summer, and with them came a restlessness I could not shake. Eleanor was thriving, growing stronger each day, her gray eyes now following my movements with curious intelligence. She had begun to smile, a toothless grin that lit up her entire face, and the sound of her laughter, rare and precious, felt like a balm to my weary soul. But even as I delighted in her small milestones, I could not ignore the tension that continued to build within the manor's walls. The Duke visited the nursery more frequently, sometimes sitting in the chair by the fire, watching Eleanor with an expression that seemed to hold equal parts love and guilt. He never stayed long, and he rarely spoke, but his presence filled the room with an intensity that made my breath catch. One evening, he arrived later than usual, and I could smell whiskey on his breath, see the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. He asked if he could hold Eleanor, and I carefully placed her in his arms. He cradled her with a tenderness that surprised me, his large hands so gentle against her tiny body. He whispered to her, words I could not quite hear, and I saw tears glisten in his eyes, though they never fell. When he handed her back to me, his fingers brushed mine, and he looked at me, really looked at me, as though seeing me for the first time. He thanked me for caring for his daughter, for loving her when others could not, and his voice was rough with emotion. I told him it was my honor, that Eleanor was a joy, and he nodded, then left without another word. I stood there, holding the baby, my heart pounding, and I realized that the Duke was not the cold, distant figure I had first imagined. He was a man in pain, torn between duty and love, and Eleanor was both his salvation and his torment. The Duchess, by contrast, remained an enigma. I rarely saw her, and when I did, she moved through the house like a shadow, never acknowledging my presence. But I began to notice small things. The way she would pause outside the nursery door, her hand raised as though to knock before turning away. The way her eyes would follow me when I carried Eleanor through the halls, filled with a longing so intense it made my chest ache. I wondered if she wanted to love the child, if somewhere beneath the anger and hurt there was a part of her that yearned to be Eleanor's mother. But the betrayal was too great, the wound too fresh, and she could not bring herself to cross that threshold. It was a tragedy, I thought, that 3 people who should have been a family were instead trapped in separate prisons of their own making. Mrs. Calloway summoned me to her office one morning, and I went with a sense of foreboding. She closed the door behind me and told me, in her clipped, efficient manner, that the household would be hosting a small gathering in 2 weeks' time. The Duke's business associates and a few members of the local gentry would be attending, and it was imperative that everything run smoothly. She emphasized that I was to keep Eleanor in the nursery during the event, that under no circumstances was the child to be seen by the guests. She did not explain why, but I understood. Eleanor was a secret, a scandal contained within these walls, and her existence could not be risked in the public eye. I agreed, though the idea of hiding the child away as though she were something shameful made my stomach turn. Eleanor was innocent. She deserved better than to be treated like a burden. The day of the gathering arrived, and the manor transformed. Servants bustled through the halls, polishing silver and arranging flowers, and the smell of roasted meats and fresh bread drifted up from the kitchens. I kept Eleanor in the nursery as instructed, but I could hear the sounds of laughter and conversation rising from below, the clink of glasses and the strains of a string quartet. It was a world I did not belong to, a world of wealth and privilege that felt 1,000,000 miles away from my small room and the baby in my arms. But as the evening wore on, my curiosity got the better of me. I waited until Eleanor was asleep, then crept to the landing where I could look down into the entrance hall. The guests were elegant, the women in gowns of silk and lace, the men in tailored suits, and among them I saw the Duke standing near the fireplace, his expression carefully neutral as he made polite conversation. And then I saw the Duchess. She descended the grand staircase in a gown of midnight blue, her hair swept up and adorned with pearls, and she was breathtaking. But there was something fragile in her beauty, a brittleness that seemed ready to shatter at the slightest touch. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, smiling and nodding, playing the role of the perfect hostess. But her eyes were empty, and I could see the effort it took to maintain the facade. I watched as she and the Duke stood side by side, greeting their guests, and to anyone who did not know better, they looked like the ideal couple, united and content. But I knew the truth. They were strangers bound by marriage and obligation, and the space between them was filled with all the words they could not say. I returned to the nursery, my heart heavy, and sat beside Eleanor's cradle. I thought about the life she would have, growing up in this house of secrets and sorrow. Would she ever know her mother? Would she ever understand why the Duchess could not love her? And what would happen when she was old enough to ask questions? To demand answers that no one wanted to give? I did not have the answers, but I knew that I would do everything in my power to ensure she grew up feeling loved and wanted. She would not carry the shame of her birth. I would see to that. The following morning, Thomas found me in the garden again, and this time with Eleanor napping peacefully in her pram. He told me the story I had been waiting to hear. He said the Duke had fallen in love 3 years ago with a woman named Catherine. She was the daughter of a country vicar, intelligent and kind, and when the Duke met her at a charity event, he was captivated. They began a courtship in secret, knowing that his family and society would never approve of a match between a duke and a woman of such modest birth. But the Duke did not care. He loved her with a passion that consumed him, and he planned to marry her. Consequences be damned. Thomas paused, his expression pained, and I felt my heart clench, knowing that this story could only end in tragedy. Catherine became pregnant, Thomas continued, and the Duke was overjoyed. He intended to announce their engagement, to bring her into the manor as his wife, but before he could, his father discovered the relationship. The old Duke was furious, demanded that his son end the affair immediately and fulfill his duty by marrying the Duchess, a woman from a respectable family whose dowry would secure the estate's future. The Duke refused, but his father threatened to disinherit him, to strip him of everything he had known. And Catherine, sweet Catherine, told the Duke she would not be the cause of his ruin. She left, disappearing into the countryside, and the Duke, broken and defeated, married the Duchess out of obligation. It was a marriage without love, a union forged in duty and resentment, and both of them knew it. Thomas said that Catherine gave birth alone, in a small cottage far from Ashford, and died hours later from complications. A midwife sent word to the Duke, and he went to her, arriving too late to say goodbye. All that remained was the baby, Eleanor, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's gentle spirit. The Duke brought her home, claiming she was adopted, knowing that the truth would destroy what little remained of his marriage. But everyone in the household knew. They saw the resemblance, heard the whispers, and understood that Eleanor was the living proof of a love that defied convention and paid the ultimate price. The Duchess, childless and heartbroken, was forced to accept the child into her home, though she could not bring herself to love her. And so the manor became a place of ghosts, haunted by the memory of Catherine and the tragedy of what might have been. I listened to Thomas's story with tears streaming down my face, and when he finished, I looked at Eleanor, sleeping peacefully in her pram, and I felt a grief so profound it threatened to consume me. This child was born of true love, of a passion that had defied the world, and her mother had died bringing her into it. The Duke had lost everything, his love, his freedom, his happiness, and now he lived in a house filled with reminders of all he had sacrificed. and the Duchess, trapped in a loveless marriage, could not escape the shadow of the woman who had claimed her husband's heart. It was a tragedy worthy of the great novels, but it was real, and it was happening here, in this house, every single day. Thomas placed a hand on my shoulder and told me to be kind to all of them, to the Duke, the Duchess, and especially to Eleanor. He said that love, even when it ends in loss, is still worth celebrating, and that Catherine would have wanted her daughter to grow up surrounded by compassion, not bitterness. I promised him I would honor that wish, that I would raise Eleanor with the knowledge that she was born of love, not shame. And I would do everything in my power to help the Duke and Duchess find a way to live with the choices they had made, to perhaps, one day, find peace. That night, as I rocked Eleanor to sleep, I sang her a lullaby my mother had taught me, one about a rose that bloomed in winter, beautiful and brave despite the cold. I thought about Catherine, about the courage it must have taken to love the Duke, to carry his child, to choose his future over her own happiness. And I thought about the Duke, who visited the nursery every night, who looked at Eleanor with such tenderness and such pain. He had claimed this child, brought her into his home, and given her his protection, even though it cost him his marriage and his peace. That was love, I realized. Not the grand declarations or the passionate embraces, but the quiet, daily acts of sacrifice and devotion. And if that love could endure, if it could survive loss and scandal and heartbreak, then perhaps there was hope for all of us. The weeks that followed brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the manor. The Duke began to spend more time at home, less time away on business, and I noticed he seemed calmer, more at peace. He still visited the nursery each evening, but now he would sometimes speak to me, asking about Eleanor's day, commenting on how much she had grown. We developed a quiet rapport, built on our shared love for the child, and I began to see past the stern exterior to the man beneath. He was not cold or unfeeling. He was simply weary, worn down by duty and loss, and in Eleanor he found a reason to keep going, a light in the darkness that had consumed him. The Duchess, too, seemed to change, though her transformation was more subtle. She no longer fled when I appeared with Eleanor, and once, when I encountered her in the hallway, she stopped and looked at the baby for a long moment. She did not speak, but her expression softened, and I saw a flicker of something that might have been longing, or regret, or perhaps the beginning of acceptance. I curtsied and moved past her, but I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the Duchess could find a way to see Eleanor not as a reminder of betrayal, but as a child who needed love. It would take time and patience and a willingness to forgive, but I believed it was possible. Love, after all, could heal even the deepest wounds, if given the chance. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden with Eleanor, the Duke approached me. It was unusual for him to seek me out during the day, and I rose quickly, thinking something was wrong. But he simply asked if he might sit with us, and I gestured to the bench beside me. We sat in companionable silence, watching Eleanor reach for the flowers, her tiny fingers grasping at petals that danced just out of reach. The Duke told me he was grateful for my care, that he knew Eleanor was thriving because of me. I started to protest, to say I was simply doing my duty, but he shook his head. He said that duty was one thing, but love was another, and that I clearly loved his daughter. I admitted that I did, that it was impossible not to love such a sweet, innocent child. And he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, and said that Catherine would have liked me. His words touched me deeply, and I felt tears prick my eyes. I told him I wished I could have known her, and he said that in some ways, I did. He said that every time I held Eleanor, every time I sang to her or soothed her tears, I was honoring Catherine's memory, carrying on the love she had poured into this child during the brief time they had together. It was the most he had ever spoken about Catherine, and I could hear the ache in his voice, the love that had never diminished, despite the years and the loss. I reached out, hesitantly, and placed my hand over his, a small gesture of comfort. He looked at me, surprised, and then he turned his hand over and squeezed mine gently. We sat like that for a moment, connected by our shared love for Eleanor and our shared grief for the woman we had both, in different ways, lost. That evening, as I prepared Eleanor for bed, I heard raised voices from the floor below. It was the Duke and Duchess again, but this time, the anger seemed tinged with exhaustion, as though they were both too tired to keep fighting. I could not make out the words, but I heard the Duchess say something about leaving, about finding a life away from this place, and the Duke's response, low and pained, that she was free to go if she wished, that he would not hold her to a marriage neither of them wanted. Then there was silence, and the sound of a door closing, and I wondered if this was the beginning of the end, if the fragile structure that held this household together was finally crumbling. But when I looked at Eleanor, sleeping peacefully, I reminded myself that whatever happened between the Duke and Duchess, she would be protected. She had me and she had her father, and that would have to be enough. Morning came, and with it, an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Calloway informed me that the Duchess wished to see me in her private sitting room, and my heart raced as I made my way to the second floor, Eleanor in my arms. The Duchess's rooms were decorated in shades of cream and gold, elegant and understated, and she sat by the window, gazing out at the gardens. She turned as I entered, and for the first time since I had arrived at Ashford Manor, she spoke directly to me. She asked if she could hold Eleanor, and I hesitated, unsure, but the look in her eyes was not one of anger or resentment. It was vulnerability, raw and honest, and I could not refuse. I placed Eleanor gently in her arms, and the Duchess looked down at the baby, her expression unreadable. She held Eleanor carefully, as though afraid she might break, and she traced a finger along the baby's cheek. She said that Eleanor looked like her father, that it was impossible not to see the resemblance, and her voice was quiet, almost resigned. She told me she had spent years praying for a child, that the inability to conceive had been the greatest sorrow of her life. And now, she said, she was surrounded by reminders of what she could not have, what another woman had given the Duke so easily. But as she held Eleanor, something shifted in her face, and she whispered that the child was not to blame, that Eleanor was innocent, and perhaps in time she could learn to see her as such. It was not a declaration of love, but it was a beginning, a small crack in the wall she had built around her heart. I left the Duchess's sitting room with a sense of cautious optimism. The road ahead would not be easy, and there would be more pain, more conflict, more moments of doubt. But I believed, in that moment, that healing was possible, that the love Eleanor inspired could be a bridge between the Duke and Duchess, a way for them to find common ground. And as I carried Eleanor back to the nursery, I whispered to her that she was more powerful than she knew, that her very existence was changing the lives of everyone around her. She looked up at me with those wise gray eyes, and I swore I saw understanding there, as though she knew, even at such a young age, that she was meant for something more than just surviving. She was meant to heal, to bring light into the darkness, to prove that love, in all its forms, could triumph over pain. The summer brought warmth to Ashford Manor, and with it, a tentative peace that felt fragile but precious. Eleanor was growing rapidly, her laughter now a frequent sound in the nursery, her curiosity leading her to reach for everything within grasp. She had begun to recognize faces, and her smile when she saw me, or the Duke, or even, occasionally, the Duchess, was a gift that never failed to lift my spirits. The household seemed to breathe a little easier, as though the weight of secrets and sorrow had lightened, if only slightly. But I knew better than to trust appearances. In a place like this, peace was always temporary, always shadowed by the past that refused to stay buried. The Duchess began to visit the nursery more regularly, always in the afternoons when the house was quiet. At first, she would simply stand in the doorway, watching Eleanor play, her expression unreadable. But gradually, she moved closer, sitting in the chair by the window, accepting the cup of tea I offered, and even on rare occasions holding Eleanor on her lap. She never stayed long, and she rarely spoke, but her presence was a statement in itself. She was trying, in her own way, to accept the child she had not chosen, to find a place in her heart for the daughter of the woman who had stolen her husband's love. I admired her courage even as I ached for her pain. Forgiveness, I was learning, was not a single act, but a journey, one that required strength and humility in equal measure. One afternoon, as the Duchess sat with Eleanor, she asked me about my own family. It was the first personal question she had ever directed at me, and I was so surprised I nearly dropped the teacup I was holding. I told her about my mother, a widow who had raised me alone after my father died in a factory accident, about the small village where I had grown up, and the dreams I had harbored of becoming a teacher before circumstances forced me to seek employment as a servant. The Duchess listened quietly, and when I finished, she said that loss was a burden we all carried in different ways, that she understood what it meant to have one's hopes taken away. Her words were simple, but they held a depth of feeling that moved me. In that moment, she was not the cold, distant Duchess, but simply a woman who had known sorrow and was trying to survive it. She asked if I ever thought about leaving, about returning to my mother and building a different life. I admitted that I had, in the early days, when the tension in the manor felt unbearable and I questioned whether I belonged here. But now, I said, I could not imagine leaving Eleanor. She had become more than just a charge to me. She was a part of my heart, and I would stay as long as she needed me. The Duchess nodded slowly, and I thought I saw a flicker of respect in her eyes. She said that Eleanor was fortunate to have someone who cared for her so deeply, and that she hoped, in time, to be someone Eleanor could turn to as well. It was not a promise, but it was an intention. And that was enough. The Duke, too, seemed to find a measure of contentment during those summer months. He spent more time at home, often joining Eleanor and me in the garden, where he would sit on the grass and let her climb over him, her small hands grasping at his coat buttons, her giggles filling the air. Watching them together, I saw the man he might have been if circumstances had been different, if he had been free to marry Catherine and raise their daughter in a home filled with love rather than obligation. There was a lightness to him in those moments, a joy that erased the years of grief and regret. And sometimes, when he looked at me, I felt a connection that went beyond our shared care for Eleanor, something unspoken, but real. One evening, as we walked back to the house after a particularly long afternoon in the garden, the Duke stopped and turned to me. He said that he wanted to thank me, not just for caring for Eleanor, but for bringing life back into this house. He said that before I arrived, the manor had felt like a mausoleum, a place where people existed but did not truly live. But I had changed that, with my warmth and my dedication, and he was grateful. I did not know what to say. I stammered something about it being my duty, but he shook his head. He said it was more than duty, that I had given Eleanor the love her mother would have given her, and that I had shown both him and the Duchess that it was possible to move forward, even when the past felt insurmountable. His words stayed with me long after we parted, and I found myself wondering if perhaps I had found more than just employment at Ashford Manor. Perhaps I had found a purpose. But even as the days grew brighter, shadows remained. Mrs. Calloway continued to watch me with a wary eye, as though she suspected I knew too much, and the other servants still kept their distance. I sensed that not everyone was pleased with the changes taking place, that there were those who believed Eleanor should have been sent away, hidden from sight, rather than embraced. Whispers reached my ears when I passed through the corridors, fragments of conversations that spoke of scandal and impropriety, of a household that had lost its sense of decorum. I tried to ignore them, to focus on Eleanor and the fragile peace we had built, but I could not shake the feeling that something was coming, some reckoning that would test us all. It arrived in the form of a letter, delivered one morning by a courier dressed in formal livery. Mrs. Calloway brought it to the Duke's study, and I saw her emerge an hour later, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line. She summoned me to the library, where the Duke and Duchess were waiting, and as I entered, I felt a chill run down my spine. The Duke held the letter in his hand, and his expression was grim. He told me that Catherine's family, who had been silent since her death, had learned of Eleanor's existence. They were demanding to see the child, claiming they had a right to know their daughter's only legacy. The Duke said he had refused, that he would not allow them to disrupt Eleanor's life, but the family had threatened to take the matter to court, to challenge his claim to the child. I felt my knees weaken, and I gripped the back of a chair for support. The thought of Eleanor being taken away, of her being torn from the only home she had known, was unbearable. The Duchess spoke then, her voice steady, despite the fear I could see in her eyes. She said that they could not let that happen, that Eleanor belonged here, with us. It was the first time she had referred to the household as a collective, as though she, the Duke, and I were united in our care for the child. The Duke agreed, saying he would fight the claim with every resource at his disposal. But he warned that the process could be lengthy and public, that the scandal we had worked so hard to contain might be exposed for all of society to see. I asked what would happen to Eleanor during this time, and he assured me she would remain at Ashford Manor, under my care, no matter what. But his eyes betrayed his worry, and I knew that the peace we had found was slipping away. The days that followed were tense and uncertain. The Duke spent hours in his study, meeting with solicitors and drafting responses to the family's demands. The Duchess withdrew once more, her brief forays into the nursery ceasing as she retreated into herself. And I clung to Eleanor, holding her close, whispering promises that I would never let her go, that I would protect her with my life if necessary. She seemed to sense the change in the household, becoming fussier, harder to soothe, and I sang to her endlessly, rocking her until my arms ached, trying to give her the security she needed, even as my own world felt like it was crumbling. Thomas found me in the garden one afternoon, Eleanor asleep in my arms, tears streaming down my face. He sat beside me and asked what had happened, and I told him everything, about the letter, the threat, the fear that Eleanor would be taken from us. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he said that Catherine's family had never approved of her relationship with the Duke, that they had disowned her when she became pregnant, refusing to help her even as she struggled alone. He said that their sudden interest in Eleanor was not born of love, but of spite, a desire to punish the Duke for the choices their daughter had made. He assured me that the Duke would prevail, that no court would take a child from her father and place her with a family that had turned their backs on her mother. His words gave me a measure of comfort, but I could not shake the fear that lingered in my chest. Weeks passed, and the solicitors went back and forth, negotiating terms and gathering evidence. The Duke compiled letters that Catherine had written to him, testifying to her love and her desire for him to raise their daughter. He brought in witnesses, including the midwife who had been present at Eleanor's birth, who confirmed that Catherine's dying wish had been for the Duke to claim their child and keep her safe. The case was strong, the Duke's lawyers assured him, but the family was determined, and the proceedings dragged on. I watched the Duke grow more haggard, the weight of the fight taking its toll, and I wished I could do more than simply care for Eleanor. I wished I could fight for her, stand before the court, and testify to the love that surrounded her here, to the home she had found in this manor despite its flaws. One evening, as I put Eleanor to bed, the Duke came to the nursery earlier than usual. He looked exhausted, but there was a light in his eyes that had not been there in weeks. He told me that the family had withdrawn their claim, that they had accepted a settlement in exchange for relinquishing all rights to Eleanor. He said it was over, that she was safe, that no one could take her from him now. I felt a rush of relief so powerful it nearly brought me to my knees, and I sank into the chair, tears of joy and gratitude streaming down my face. The Duke knelt beside me, taking my hands in his, and he thanked me for my strength, for my unwavering love for his daughter. He said that he did not know what he would have done without me, that I had been Eleanor's anchor through the storm. And in that moment, I felt a bond between us that went beyond master and servant, something deeper and more profound. The Duchess appeared in the doorway, and I rose quickly, embarrassed to be caught in such an intimate moment. But she did not seem angry. Instead, she looked at the Duke and me, and then at Eleanor sleeping peacefully in her cradle, and she said that perhaps it was time for all of us to move forward, to stop living in the shadow of the past. She said that Eleanor deserved a family, not a house divided by guilt and resentment, and that she was willing to try, truly try, to be a mother to the child. The Duke looked at her with an expression of surprise and hope, and he said that he would welcome that he had always hoped she might find a way to love Eleanor. The Duchess nodded, and she crossed the room to the cradle, gazing down at the sleeping baby. She reached out and gently touched Eleanor's hair, and when she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. She said that it would not be easy, that she could not erase the pain of the past, but that she was willing to begin again for Eleanor's sake. In the weeks that followed, I watched the transformation of Ashford Manor with a sense of wonder. The Duchess began to take an active role in Eleanor's care, joining me for morning feedings, helping with baths, even reading to her from a book of fairy tales. She was awkward at first, unsure of how to hold the baby or soothe her cries, but with time and patience, she grew more confident. Eleanor, for her part, responded to the Duchess's efforts with smiles and giggles, as though she understood that this woman, too, was learning to love her. The Duke watched these interactions with a mixture of relief and gratitude, and I could see the weight lifting from his shoulders, the tension that had defined him for so long beginning to ease. Thomas told me one day that the manor felt different, that the air itself seemed lighter. He said that love had a way of transforming even the darkest places, and that Eleanor, with her innocent smile and her boundless joy, had brought healing to a household that had been broken. I agreed, though I knew the journey was far from over. The Duke and Duchess would need time to rebuild their marriage, to find a way to coexist, not just as parents to Eleanor, but as partners. But they had taken the first steps, and that was what mattered. They had chosen to fight for this child, to put aside their own pain and create a home where she could thrive. And I, who had arrived as a stranger, had become a part of that home, a witness to the power of love to overcome even the greatest obstacles. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden with Eleanor, the Duke and Duchess joined us. We sat together on a blanket spread beneath the shade of an old oak tree, and the Duchess held Eleanor on her lap, tickling her and eliciting peals of laughter. The Duke watched them with a smile, and then he turned to me and said that he had been thinking about the future. He said that Eleanor would need stability, a family that was united, and that he wanted to ensure I remained a part of that family. He offered to make my position permanent, to give me a contract that would guarantee my place at Ashford Manor for as long as I wished to stay. He said that Eleanor loved me, that she needed me, and that he could not imagine raising her without my help. I was deeply moved by his words, and I accepted without hesitation. This was where I belonged, with this child and this family, imperfect though it was. The Duchess added that she hoped I would stay as well, that she had come to value my presence and my guidance. She said that she had much to learn about being a mother, and that she would be grateful for my patience as she found her way. I assured her that I would be honored to help, that watching her and Eleanor bond had been one of the greatest joys of my life. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. We were not a conventional family, the four of us. We were bound together by tragedy and circumstance, by secrets and second chances. But we were a family nonetheless, and that was enough. As the summer drew to a close, I reflected on how much had changed since that cold morning when I first arrived at Ashford Manor. I had come here as a servant, seeking security and a wage to help my mother. But I had found so much more. I had found purpose in caring for Eleanor, strength in navigating the complexities of the household, and hope in witnessing the healing that love could bring. The Duke and Duchess were not the same people they had been when I arrived. They had been tested, pushed to the very edge of what they could endure, and they had chosen to fight, not just for Eleanor, but for each other. And I, too, had been transformed. I was no longer the frightened girl who had stepped through those iron gates. I was a woman who had learned that love, in all its forms, was worth fighting for. Eleanor, growing stronger and more curious with each passing day, was the heart of this transformation. She did not know about the scandal surrounding her birth, or the pain her existence had caused, or the battles that had been fought to keep her safe. She knew only love, the love of her father, the growing affection of the woman she would come to call mother, and the unwavering devotion of the nursemaid who had cared for her from her earliest days. And that, I thought, was exactly as it should be. She would grow up in a home that had been broken and mended, surrounded by people who had learned that forgiveness was possible, that second chances were real, and that the bonds of family could be forged not just by blood, but by choice. As I carried Eleanor up to the nursery that evening, the sun setting in shades of gold and amber, I felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would still have challenges, moments of doubt and conflict, but I believed we would face them together. The Duke and Duchess were learning to be partners, to communicate and compromise, and Eleanor was the bridge that connected them, the reminder of what they were fighting for. I tucked her into her cradle, kissed her soft forehead, and whispered that she was loved, so very loved, by all of us. And as she drifted off to sleep, I sat by the window, looking out at the estate that had become my home, and I knew that I had found exactly where I was meant to be. Autumn arrived with a crispness in the air that seemed to sharpen everything, the colors of the leaves, the sounds of the birds preparing for winter, the very quality of light that filtered through the windows of Ashford Manor. Eleanor was nearly a year old now, taking her first tentative steps, babbling in a language only she understood, and reaching for the world with an eagerness that never failed to make me smile. She had become the center of the household, the sun around which we all orbited, and the transformation in the Duke and Duchess was nothing short of remarkable. They were not perfectly happy, perhaps they never would be, but they had found a way to coexist with grace and mutual respect, and in their own ways, they both loved Eleanor fiercely. The Duchess had embraced motherhood with a dedication that surprised even me. She spent hours with Eleanor, teaching her simple songs, showing her picture books, delighting in every small achievement. She had shed the brittleness that had once defined her, and in its place was a softness, a vulnerability that made her more human, more real. She confided in me one afternoon that caring for Eleanor had given her life meaning again, that the child had filled a void she had thought would remain empty forever. She said she would never forget Catherine, that she understood now that the Duke's love for that woman had been genuine and deep, but that she had made peace with it. Eleanor was not a reminder of betrayal anymore. She was simply her daughter, the child she had always longed for, even if she had not given birth to her. The Duke, too, had changed. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for so long had faded, replaced by a quiet contentment. He was more present, more engaged with the running of the estate, and he had begun to rebuild his relationship with the Duchess. They took walks together in the evenings, Eleanor toddling between them, holding their hands, and I would watch from the nursery window, my heart swelling with a mixture of joy and longing. They were becoming a family, not the family the Duke had imagined with Catherine, but a family nonetheless, built on shared love for a child and a willingness to forgive the past. I was happy for them, truly, but I could not deny the small ache in my chest, the awareness that I was still, in many ways, an outsider looking in. My role in the household had evolved. I was no longer just a nursemaid. I was a trusted member of the family, consulted on decisions about Eleanor's care and education, invited to join them for meals in the informal dining room, treated with a respect that went beyond my station. The Duke often sought my opinion on matters related to Eleanor, and the Duchess asked for my advice on everything from clothing to discipline. I had become essential to their lives, and yet I knew that as Eleanor grew older, she would need me less. One day, she would not require a nursemaid at all, and I would have to decide what my place in this household would be. The thought filled me with a strange mixture of sadness and uncertainty, and I tried not to dwell on it, focusing instead on the present, on the precious time I still had with the child who had become the daughter of my heart. It was during this time of relative peace that a new complication arose, one I had not anticipated. The Duke's younger brother, Lord William, arrived at Ashford Manor for an extended visit. I had heard of him from the servants, who spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and wariness. He was charming and handsome, they said, but also reckless, a gambler and a seducer who had left a trail of broken hearts across London. The Duke had been estranged from him for years, disapproving of his lifestyle. But William had written requesting to visit, claiming he wished to mend their relationship and meet his niece. The Duke had reluctantly agreed, though I could see the tension in his jaw when he spoke of it. Lord William arrived on a grey afternoon, his carriage pulling up to the manor with a flourish. I watched from the nursery window as he stepped out, and I was struck immediately by how different he was from the Duke. Where the Duke was reserved and formal, William was animated and expressive, his laughter carrying up to where I stood. He was younger by several years, perhaps 30, with the same dark hair and grey eyes as his brother, but his features were softer, more approachable. He bounded up the steps like a man without a care in the world, and I wondered what had brought him here, what he truly wanted from the Duke. I met him that evening when the Duke brought him to the nursery to meet Eleanor. William swept into the room with the energy of a summer storm, his eyes taking in everything at once, and when he saw Eleanor, he broke into a wide grin. He scooped her up without hesitation, spinning her around until she squealed with delight, and I found myself smiling despite my reservations. He was good with children, that much was clear, and Eleanor took to him immediately, patting his face with her small hands and babbling happily. The Duke watched with a mixture of amusement and caution, and I sensed he was waiting to see if William would prove himself worthy of his trust. William turned his attention to me, his gaze appraising, but not unkind. He introduced himself with a bow that was both elegant and slightly mocking, as though he found the formality amusing, and he said he had heard much about me from the servants. He said that the household spoke of me with admiration, that I had brought light to a dark place, and that he was curious to meet the woman who had managed such a feat. I felt my cheeks flush, unsure how to respond to such bold flattery, and I stammered something about simply doing my duty. He laughed, a rich, warm sound, and said that duty alone could not account for the devotion he saw in Eleanor's eyes when she looked at me. He was perceptive. I realized, beneath the charm and the easy manner, and I would need to be careful around him. The days that followed were lively in a way the manor had not been before. William filled the house with laughter and music, playing the piano in the drawing room, organizing games for Eleanor, and coaxing smiles from even the most reserved servants. He had a gift for putting people at ease, for making them feel seen and valued, and I found myself drawn to him despite my better judgment. He sought me out often, engaging me in conversation about everything from books to politics to my own dreams and aspirations. He listened with genuine interest, asked thoughtful questions, and made me feel, for the first time in my life, that my opinions mattered, that I was more than just a servant. But I was not naive. I saw the way he watched the Duchess when she was not looking, the way his smile faltered when he observed the Duke and Eleanor together. There was something beneath his cheerful exterior, a loneliness or a longing that he kept carefully hidden. I wondered what had driven him to Ashford Manor, whether he truly sought reconciliation with his brother, or if he was running from something, or someone, in London. I asked Thomas what he knew of Lord William, and he told me that William had always been the favourite of their late father, indulged and spoiled, but that after the old Duke's death, he had squandered much of his inheritance on gambling and ill-advised investments. He was rumoured to be in debt, Thomas said, and there were whispers that he had been involved in a scandal with a married woman. I filed this information away, reminding myself to guard my heart, even as I enjoyed his company. One afternoon, William asked if he might accompany Eleanor and me on our daily walk through the gardens. The Duke had gone to town on business, and the Duchess was resting, so I agreed, thinking it would be harmless enough. We strolled through the paths lined with late-blooming roses, Eleanor toddling ahead of us, chasing butterflies with unsteady steps. William spoke of his travels, of the places he had seen and the people he had met, and his stories were so vivid, I felt as though I were there with him. He asked about my own life, and I found myself sharing things I had never told anyone, about my father's death, my mother's struggles, my own abandoned dreams of becoming a teacher. He listened without judgment, and when I finished, he said that it was not too late, that I could still pursue those dreams if I chose. His words stirred something in me, a hope I had thought long buried, and I did not know whether to be grateful or afraid. As we walked, William grew more serious. He told me he admired what I had done for Eleanor, for his brother, for the entire household. He said that I had a gift for bringing people together, for healing wounds that seemed beyond repair. He asked if I had ever considered my own happiness, if I had ever thought about building a life beyond these walls. I admitted that I had, but that I could not imagine leaving Eleanor, that she needed me. He said that perhaps one day she would not need me as much, and that I should not tie my entire future to a child who would grow up and no longer require a nursemaid. His words, though gently spoken, struck a nerve, and I realized he had voiced the very fear I had been trying to ignore. What would become of me when Eleanor no longer needed me? Who would I be? That evening, as I prepared Eleanor for bed, I found myself thinking about William's words, about the possibility of a different life. But even as I considered it, I knew I could not leave. Not yet. Eleanor was still so young, and the Duke and Duchess, though they had come far, still relied on me. And if I was honest with myself, I did not want to leave. This place, these people, had become my family, and I could not imagine walking away from them. But William's questions had planted a seed of doubt, a whisper that perhaps I was sacrificing too much, that I deserved a chance at happiness of my own. I pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on Eleanor's bedtime routine, but they lingered at the edges of my mind, refusing to be silenced. William's visit stretched from days into weeks, and I began to notice a shift in the household's dynamics. The Duke grew more tense, his patience with his brother wearing thin. They argued behind closed doors, their voices raised in disputes I could not quite hear, and I sensed that old wounds were being reopened, old resentments aired. The Duchess, meanwhile, seemed drawn to William's charm, laughing at his jokes and seeking his company, and I wondered if the Duke noticed, if he felt a flicker of jealousy or concern. I tried to stay out of their affairs, to focus on Eleanor, but it was impossible not to be affected by the tension that simmered beneath the surface. One evening, William found me in the library, where I had gone to find a book to read to Eleanor. He closed the door behind him, and I felt a flutter of unease. He told me he needed to speak with me, that he had something important to say. He confessed that he had come to Ashford Manor not just to see his brother, but because he was in trouble. He had accrued debts he could not pay, and creditors were threatening him with debtor's prison. He had hoped the Duke might help him, might give him a loan or a position on the estate, but his brother had refused, saying that William needed to learn responsibility, to face the consequences of his choices. William looked at me with desperation in his eyes, and he asked if I might speak to the Duke on his behalf, if I might persuade him to show mercy. I was taken aback by his request. I told him I had no influence over the Duke's decisions, that it would be inappropriate for me to interfere in family matters. But William insisted, saying that the Duke respected me, that he valued my opinion, and that a word from me might make all the difference. He reached for my hand, his grip urgent, and he said he had nowhere else to turn, that I was his only hope. I pulled away, my heart pounding, and I told him I would think about it, but that I could not promise anything. He thanked me, his relief palpable, and he left the library, leaving me shaken and confused. I did not know what to do. I sympathized with William's plight, but I also understood the Duke's reasoning. How could I take sides in such a matter? I sought counsel from Thomas, who listened to my dilemma with his usual patience. He advised me to stay out of it, saying that the Duke and his brother needed to resolve their issues without my involvement. He reminded me that William, for all his charm, had a history of manipulation, of using people to get what he wanted. He said I should be careful, that I should not let my kind heart lead me into a situation I might regret. I knew Thomas was right, but I could not shake the image of William's desperate face, the plea in his eyes. I decided to speak with the Duke, not to advocate for William, but to understand his perspective, to see if there was any way to help without overstepping my bounds. The Duke received me in his study, and I could see the weariness in his face, the burden of dealing with his brother's problems weighing on him. I asked, as delicately as I could, about William's situation, and he sighed deeply before explaining. He said that he had bailed William out of trouble more times than he could count, that he had given him money, opportunities, second chances, and each time William had squandered them. He said that if he helped William now, he would only be enabling his destructive behavior, and that the only way his brother would learn was to face the consequences of his actions. I listened, and I understood. The Duke was not being cruel. He was being a responsible older brother, trying to teach William a lesson that their father never had. I thanked him for his honesty, and I told him I supported his decision, that I would not interfere. When I told William that I could not help him, he reacted with anger. He accused me of being heartless, of siding with the Duke because of my position in the household. He said that I had led him to believe we were friends, that he had trusted me, and now I was abandoning him just like everyone else. His words stung, but I held my ground. I told him that I cared about him, but that I could not undermine the Duke's authority, and that he needed to take responsibility for his own life. He stormed off, and I did not see him for several days. The atmosphere in the manor grew even more strained, and I felt caught in the middle of a conflict I had not created and did not know how to resolve. It was the Duchess who finally confronted William. I was not present for their conversation, but I heard about it from Mrs. Calloway, who had witnessed the exchange. The Duchess had found William in the drawing room, drinking heavily, and she had told him, in no uncertain terms, that he needed to leave Ashford Manor. She said that he was disrupting the peace of the household, that he was causing problems between the Duke and herself, and that he was taking advantage of people's kindness, including mine. She said that she had learned, through her own painful experience, that sometimes the hardest act of love was to let someone face the consequences of their choices, and that she would not stand by and watch him drag others down with him. William had left the next morning, without saying goodbye, and the manor felt lighter in his absence, though I could not help but feel a pang of sadness for him. The Duke thanked the Duchess for her intervention, and I witnessed a moment of genuine connection between them, a shared understanding that they were partners in protecting their family. The Duchess told him that she had not defended the household out of duty, but out of love, that she had finally come to see Ashford Manor as her home, and Eleanor, the Duke, and even me as her family. The Duke embraced her, and I saw tears in his eyes, and I knew that they had turned a corner, that their marriage, though it had been forged in pain, had the potential to become something real and lasting. I excused myself quietly, giving them privacy, but my heart was full. They had fought for each other, and for Eleanor, and they had won. In the weeks that followed, the household settled back into its rhythm. Eleanor continued to grow and thrive, her personality emerging more each day. She was curious and affectionate, clever and strong-willed, and she brought joy to everyone around her. The Duke and Duchess grew closer, finding ways to support and understand each other, and I watched their transformation with a sense of pride and gratitude. I had played a small part in their healing, but the real work had been theirs, the choice to forgive, to try again, to build a family from the ruins of their past. And as I rocked Eleanor to sleep each night, I whispered to her about the love that surrounded her, about the people who had fought to keep her safe, and about the bright future that awaited her. But William's visit had left me with questions I could not ignore. What was my place in this family? What would happen when Eleanor no longer needed me? And was it selfish to want something more? To dream of a life beyond these walls, even as I loved the life I had found here? I did not have the answers, but I knew that I would need to face these questions eventually. For now, I focused on the present, on the child in my arms and the family I had come to love. Whatever the future held, I would meet it with the same courage and determination that had brought me through the darkest days. And I would trust that love, which had transformed this household, would guide me forward wherever that path might lead. Winter arrived at Ashford Manor with a blanket of snow that transformed the estate into something from a fairy tale. The bare trees sparkled with frost. The gardens lay quiet beneath their white covering, and inside, the fires burned bright and warm, filling the rooms with golden light and the scent of wood smoke. Eleanor was walking confidently now, chattering in her own language, and she delighted in watching the snowflakes fall past the windows, pressing her small hands against the glass and laughing with pure joy. She was almost 18 months old, growing more independent each day, and I felt the bittersweet awareness that the time was approaching when she would no longer need me in the same way. The Duke and Duchess had continued to grow closer through the autumn, and by winter they had become true partners in every sense. They consulted each other on decisions large and small, shared meals together, took walks arm in arm through the snowy grounds. I witnessed small gestures of affection between them, a touch on the shoulder, a shared smile, the way they would lean toward each other when they spoke. It was not the passionate love the Duke had shared with Catherine, but it was something perhaps more durable, built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the love they both held for Eleanor. I was happy for them, truly, but I also felt my own future becoming uncertain, a question mark that loomed larger with each passing day. One evening, the Duke asked to speak with me privately in his study. My heart raced as I made my way down the corridor, wondering what he might want to discuss. He gestured for me to sit, and he took the chair opposite mine, his expression serious but not unkind. He told me that he and the Duchess had been talking about Eleanor's future, about her education and upbringing, and they had come to a decision. They wanted to hire a governess for her, someone who could begin preparing her for the lessons she would need as she grew older. He said that I would always have a place at Ashford Manor, that they valued me deeply, but that Eleanor would soon outgrow the need for a nursemaid, and they wanted to make the transition as smooth as possible. I felt my throat tighten, though I had known this moment would come. I thanked him for his honesty, and I asked what he envisioned for my role once the governess arrived. He said that the choice was mine, that I could remain as Eleanor's companion, assisting the governess and continuing to be a presence in her life, or that I could take on other responsibilities within the household, perhaps helping to manage the staff or overseeing the charitable work the Duchess had begun in the village. He said that he would also understand if I wished to leave, to pursue my own dreams, and that if I chose that path, he would provide me with an excellent reference and a generous settlement to help me begin anew. His words were kind, but they filled me with a confusion I had not expected. What did I want? Where did I truly belong? I asked for time to consider my options, and he agreed, saying there was no rush, that the governess would not arrive until spring. I left his study and wandered to the nursery, where Eleanor was playing with her wooden blocks, stacking them and then knocking them down with gales of laughter. I sat beside her, watching her play, and I felt tears prick my eyes. This child had been my entire world for nearly 2 years. She had given my life meaning and purpose, had filled the emptiness I had carried since leaving my mother's home. But she was growing up, as all children do, and I could not hold on to her forever. I needed to decide what came next, to find a path that honored both my love for her and my own need for fulfillment. That night, I wrote to my mother for the first time in months. I told her about Eleanor, about the Duke and Duchess, about the life I had built at Ashford Manor. I told her about the choice I now faced, and I asked for her wisdom, her guidance. Her reply arrived 2 weeks later, and her words were simple but profound. She wrote that she was proud of the woman I had become, that I had done more than just survive. I had thrived. She said that love took many forms, and that loving Eleanor did not mean sacrificing my own dreams. She encouraged me to think about what would make me truly happy, not just comfortable or secure, but fulfilled. And she reminded me that I was still young, that I had time to build a life that honored both my past and my future. I thought about my mother's words for days, turning them over in my mind as I went about my duties. I thought about my old dream of becoming a teacher, of sharing knowledge and shaping young minds. I thought about how much I had learned in my time at Ashford Manor, not just about caring for children, but about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of love to transform lives. And I began to see a possibility, a way to honor both my love for Eleanor and my desire for something more. I would speak with the Duke and Duchess about my idea, and I would trust that if it was meant to be, they would support me. I requested another meeting with the Duke and Duchess, and this time, both of them were present. I told them about my dream of teaching, about how my time with Eleanor had rekindled that passion. I proposed that I stay at Ashford Manor, not as a nursemaid or even a companion, but as an educator. I could work alongside the governess, learning from her, and eventually taking on some of Eleanor's lessons myself. And in time, if they approved, I could establish a small school on the estate, offering education to the children of the staff and the village. It would be a way to give back, to share the knowledge I had gained, and to continue being part of Eleanor's life without holding her back from growing up. The Duke and Duchess listened intently, and when I finished, they exchanged a look that spoke of their shared understanding. The Duchess spoke first, saying that she thought it was a wonderful idea, that she had been wanting to do more to help the families on the estate, and that education was one of the greatest gifts they could offer. The Duke agreed, adding that he had always admired my intelligence and my dedication, and that he believed I would make an excellent teacher. He said they would support my plan fully, providing resources for the school and ensuring I had the training I needed. I felt tears of gratitude well up in my eyes, and I thanked them both, my heart overflowing with hope and excitement for this new chapter. The governess, Miss Hartley, arrived in early spring, a capable woman in her 40s with a warm smile and a genuine love for teaching. She and I formed an immediate connection, and she welcomed my assistance, saying that having another educated woman to collaborate with would be a blessing. Together, we began Eleanor's early lessons, teaching her letters and numbers, reading her stories, and encouraging her natural curiosity. Eleanor took to learning with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything, and I delighted in watching her mind unfold, in seeing her grasp new concepts and ask endless questions. I was no longer her nursemaid, but I was still an important part of her life, and that was enough. Work on the school began that summer. The Duke converted an unused building on the edge of the estate, a former storage house that with some repairs and fresh paint became a bright, welcoming space. The Duchess helped me select books and supplies, and together we spread the word throughout the village that the school would open in the autumn, offering free education to any child whose family wished to send them. The response was overwhelming. Parents who had never had the opportunity to learn themselves were eager for their children to have that chance, and I felt a sense of purpose I had never known before. This was my calling, I realized. This was what I was meant to do. Eleanor's second birthday came in late summer, and the Duke and Duchess hosted a small celebration, inviting the household staff and a few families from the village. It was a joyful affair, with games and music and a cake that Eleanor attacked with both hands, covering herself in frosting and laughing with abandon. I watched her surrounded by love, by people who cherished her and would protect her always, and I felt a deep sense of peace. She was thriving, growing into a confident, loving child, and the household that had once been fractured by secrets and pain had become a true home. That evening, after the guests had departed and Eleanor had been tucked into bed, the Duke, the Duchess, and I sat together in the drawing room, sipping tea and reflecting on how far we had all come. The Duchess said that she could not imagine her life without Eleanor now, that the child had taught her what it truly meant to be a mother, not through birth, but through love and commitment. The Duke agreed, adding that Eleanor had saved him, had given him a reason to keep living when grief threatened to consume him. And then they both turned to me, and the Duchess said that I, too, had been essential to Eleanor's happiness, that I had been the steady presence that held everything together when the world seemed to be falling apart. I told them that they had given me just as much, that they had offered me a home and a purpose when I had neither, and that I would be forever grateful. The Duke said that we were a family, an unconventional one perhaps, but a family nonetheless, bound not by blood alone, but by choice and love. And in that moment, sitting in that warm room with the people who had become my family, I knew he was right. We had all been broken in different ways, had all carried wounds that seemed impossible to heal. But we had chosen to heal together, to forgive and to try again, and in doing so, we had created something beautiful. The school opened in September, and on the first day, 15 children arrived, their faces bright with anticipation and nervousness. I stood at the door, greeting each one, and I felt a joy so profound it brought tears to my eyes. This was what I had been meant to do all along. Miss Hartley had agreed to help with the younger children, and together we created a curriculum that balanced practical skills with literature, mathematics, and history. The children thrived, and their parents expressed gratitude that moved me deeply. I was making a difference, not just in Eleanor's life, but in the lives of an entire community, and it felt like the fulfillment of every dream I had ever held. Eleanor attended the school as well, learning alongside the other children, and I watched with pride as she developed friendships and showed kindness to those who struggled. She was a natural leader, encouraging her classmates and sharing her toys without hesitation. The Duke and Duchess often visited the school, observing lessons and talking with the children, and their presence sent a powerful message to the village that they cared about the well-being of everyone on the estate, not just the wealthy or the privileged. The manor's reputation, which had been tarnished by scandal, began to be restored, and people spoke of the Duke and Duchess with respect and admiration. As the years passed, the school grew, and so did Eleanor. She was a bright, curious child who loved learning and never tired of asking questions. She knew that I was not her mother by birth, but she loved me as though I were, and I loved her with a fierceness that never diminished. The Duke and Duchess had more children, 2 sons and another daughter, and the manor filled with the sounds of laughter and running feet. The ghosts of the past did not disappear entirely, but they no longer haunted us. Catherine's memory was honored, spoken of with respect and gratitude for the gift she had given them all, and Eleanor grew up knowing that she had been born of a great love, even if that love had been brief and tragic. On Eleanor's 10th birthday, she asked me to tell her about her mother. We sat together in the library, just the 2 of us, and I told her the story Thomas had once told me, about the Duke and Catherine, about their forbidden love and the sacrifices they had made. I told her that her mother had been kind and intelligent, that she had loved her father deeply, and that her dying wish had been for Eleanor to grow up safe and loved. Eleanor listened with tears in her eyes, and when I finished, she hugged me tightly and said that she was glad her mother had trusted me to help care for her. She said that she had 2 mothers, one who had given her life and one who had taught her how to live, and that she was grateful for both. Her words broke my heart and mended it all at once, and I held her close, whispering that she was the greatest gift I had ever received. The Duke and Duchess had built a strong marriage over the years, one based on partnership and genuine affection. They were not the passionate lovers of romantic novels, but they were companions who respected and supported each other, and their children grew up in a home filled with stability and love. The Duchess never forgot the pain of her early years at Ashford Manor, but she had transformed that pain into compassion, becoming known throughout the county for her charitable work and her dedication to improving the lives of those less fortunate. The Duke, too, had found peace, channeling his energy into managing the estate responsibly and ensuring that his children, including Eleanor, would inherit not just wealth, but values. As for me, I continued to teach, watching generation after generation of children pass through the school's doors. Some went on to become tradespeople, others domestic servants, and a few even pursued higher education, scholarships arranged through the Duke's connections. I never married, though I had offers over the years. My life was full, my heart was content, and I had found a family and a purpose that satisfied me completely. I was Aunt Clara to Eleanor and her siblings, beloved and respected, and I knew that I had lived a life of meaning. When Eleanor turned 18, she told me she wanted to become a teacher like me, to carry on the work I had started. The Duke and Duchess supported her decision, and she attended a teacher's college in London, returning to Ashford Manor 2 years later to take over the school. I stepped back gradually, becoming her assistant and advisor, and I watched with pride as she expanded the curriculum and brought new ideas to the classroom. She was a natural educator, patient and inspiring, and I knew the school would thrive under her leadership. On the day I officially retired from teaching, the village held a celebration in my honor. The Duke and Duchess spoke of my contributions. The children I had taught over the years performed songs and recitations, and Eleanor presented me with a leather-bound journal filled with letters from former students, expressing their gratitude for the education I had given them. I was overwhelmed by the outpouring of love, and I realized that my life, which had begun so humbly, had made a difference in ways I could never have imagined. I spent my final years at Ashford Manor in quiet contentment, helping in the school when needed, spending time with Eleanor's children when they came along, and writing my memories in the journal the village had given me. I recorded everything: the story of the Duke and Catherine, the transformation of the household, the founding of the school, all of it, so that future generations would know the truth. I wanted Eleanor's descendants to understand that their family had been built on love and sacrifice, on forgiveness and second chances, and that those values were worth preserving. I thought often of that cold morning so many years ago when I had first arrived at Ashford Manor, frightened and uncertain, not knowing what awaited me. I had come seeking security and a wage, but I had found so much more. I had found a child who needed me, a family that embraced me, and a purpose that fulfilled me. I had witnessed the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds, to transform pain into compassion, and to build bridges where walls had once stood. And I had learned that family was not just about blood or birth, but about the people we chose to love and the commitments we chose to honor. On a spring morning in my 75th year, I sat in the garden with Eleanor, now a middle-aged woman with children of her own, and we watched the roses bloom, the same roses I had tended when she was a baby. She held my hand and thanked me for everything I had given her, for the love and the lessons and the unwavering support. I told her that she had given me just as much, that she had been the light that guided me through the darkest times, and that I would not trade a single moment of the life we had shared. She laid her head on my shoulder, and we sat in comfortable silence, two women bound by love and history, watching the world turn and knowing that we had lived well. That evening, as I prepared for bed, I looked at the portrait that hung in my small sitting room, a painting the Duke had commissioned years ago showing Eleanor as a toddler held in my arms with the manor in the background. It captured a moment of perfect happiness, and it reminded me of all that we had built together, all that we had overcome. I whispered a prayer of gratitude for the life I had been given, for the people who had loved me, and for the child who had changed everything. And as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a deep and abiding peace, knowing that my story, like Eleanor's, was one of love triumphant, of redemption earned, and of a family forged, not in perfection, but in the beautiful, messy reality of human connection. The Duke had claimed the servant's baby, and yes, the Duchess had known why the child looked just like him. But what began as scandal and heartbreak had become something far greater. It had become a story of healing, of growth, of love that transcended circumstance and transformed everyone it touched. Eleanor grew up knowing she was cherished, not despite her origins, but because of them, because she was living proof that love, true love, could survive anything. And I, the young woman who had arrived at those iron gates so long ago, had been privileged to witness it all, to be part of something larger than myself, to help write a story that would be told for generations to come. We had all been broken, the Duke, the Duchess, the servant, and the child. But we had chosen to heal together, and in doing so, we had become whole.